Welcome to week 6 of Bio 113. This week we're going to be talking about population ecology and survivorship. Okay, so what is a population, first of all? A population is a group of individuals that are in the same species that are found in a particular place, okay? So you can have a population of fish in a pond. They're the same species, but you can also have another population of frogs in that same pond. Okay, so those two are two different populations. You can have another population of fish in a different pond. So just remember, population, we're talking about a group of individuals of the same species in a particular area, a particular place. Okay, so what is survivorship? Survivorship is basically a nice way of talking about death rate. Talking about the number of individuals that survive in a population. So if you are able to, if you plot the frequency that these individuals survive to a certain age, then you get three types of curves that emerge. And I'll show you these in a second, but the first type is type 1, which you have high survivorship early on until later in life when there's a big increase in deaths. The older you get, the more the faster the increase in death occurs. So you can see this. A typical example is with humans. We got good parental care at the early in life in general, and as we get older, the closer we get to the end of life, the highest ages, you see people dying faster because they're reaching the end of life expectancy. A type 2 curve is one that shows equal survivorship throughout life. These guys can die of an accident or a disease just as likely when they're young or old. So we got things like songbirds, lizards, mice, things like that. And then type 3 curve, where you have high death early in life. But if you can make it through that first period of time, then your survival increases. And you have, if you make it to that first part, you survive to be pretty old, okay? Like things like plants, insects, fish. I always like to point out here, like if you're a oak tree and you produce, thousands of acorns, and some of those acorns, when they hit the ground, they're going to sprout, probably 100 on the sprout. But most of those aren't going to get past the sprouting age. They're going to die off. Either they're in a bad spot or they're in too much shade. But you get a few of them, a couple that may survive in a good environment, and then they will grow up. Once they establish and grow, these things can live to be 250 years old or longer. So that's type 3 curve. So why do we study survivorship in general? As scientists, we study to understand the lives of animals and things like that. But the insurance industry uses survivorship, human survivorship, to understand the risk with certain age groups. And if you have a decreased risk, your insurance charges will be, your premiums will be lower. So if you're in a higher risk group, they're going to charge more because you're more likely to die in general, and they will make more money off you before they have to pay out life insurance. Okay, so let's take a look at these three. So like I said, your type 1 curve here, you've got your well, let me point out the axes here. So on the left, you've got the number of surviving individuals, and this generally we put this in a logarithmic scale. We'll talk about that later. And on the x-axis, you've got the percent of maximum life expectancy. So you see, 50% is half the individuals are dead, 100%, all your individuals are dead. Okay, so it kind of fits if you think with life expectancy percentages. With humans, 100's a good maximum life expectancy. In general, that's not exactly true, but with something like trees, this 100% can be, like I said, around 250 years, 300 years. Birds, that might only be like 5 years, something like that. Insects, things like that. So back to type 1, you've got high survivorship early in life. And here's where you get the strong parental care at the beginning of life helps most of us survive to a certain age. And then once you get near the 75, 80% mark, you start to see a large decrease in individuals that live that long because you're reaching the end of life expectancy. And as I said, type 2 here, there's basically an equal chance of surviving throughout life, okay, until you reach your maximum life expectancy. And then with the plants or trees in type 3, you see a lot of offspring produced at the very beginning. But if you can make it past this certain point, you're likely to survive a long time. All right. So when we plot out these survivorship curves, or especially in this case, we're going to look at growth curves of populations. If you plot these out, you'll have on the left here, you got number of organisms and then just time on the bottom here. So you always start out in a lag phase. And what's happening here is you start out with one or, a couple of individuals, and they'll reproduce offspring, and they'll have a couple, and that'll make it 4 individuals, and then it duplicates on and on. And eventually, at one point, you start to move from this kind of a flat lag phase, you start to curve upward into this exponential growth phase. So when you get, 600 individuals, the next, if you duplicate that, the next number would be 1,200. So you can see you go from going up in small numbers to going up in large numbers, and that's where you get this exponential growth phase, they call it here. And they kind of call this a J-shape characteristic for these guys, all right? So if you look at an overview of an entire growth curve, you always run into something here at the end called carrying capacity, okay? So as your growth curve slows or reaches your carrying capacity, it'll actually slow down. So you start out with your log phase, you start your exponential growth, and then at a certain point, you start to reach the carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the number of individuals or species, or biological species that an environment can maintain. Basically, it's the maximum population size of that species that the environment can sustain indefinitely. So you go from lag phase, you start growing at exponential phase, your numbers are going up and up. Then you start to reach this deceleration phase. You're starting to get to the maximum carrying capacity, and you see kind of a stable equilibrium, it's called, where you get a up and down kind of maximum number of individuals. And this range here is considered your carrying capacity. That's the number of individuals that this environment can sustain. So if you were a fish living in a pond, you can imagine you can only have so many fish living in a limited space like that. You're going to have limited food and resources, things like that. So there will be a carrying capacity for that habitat. All right. And the same holds true for the earth in general and humans, as a matter of fact. So here's if you look at the upper right corner here, this is a nice overview of human population growth. Okay, and the numbers here are in billions, but we start out about the year 1200, and you can see there's a slow lag phase like we talked. This follows the same general trend. You got your lag phase, then you reach an exponential growth phase, and then you reach carrying capacity, where you start to decrease the growth. And we will approach this at some point in the future, probably not in our lifetime, but not that far off, depending on who you ask. But let's take a just brief, closer look at this lag phase area and what you might see if you zoomed in on this. About the year 1200, there's some estimates say we have about 300 to 400 million people in the earth in the year 1200. And then along comes something like the Black Plague, which is very deadly and kills roughly 200,000 people. So almost half the population or so. There are some estimates, 75 million to 200 million people died here. So about half the population died off. But quickly after that was over, bounced back. So we're in this, what you would think would be equilibrium phase here, because that's the carrying capacity at that time of the earth, based on the technology we had and things. But then you come along about 1800s and you get something like the Industrial Revolution, and you get things like the ability to transport food or to produce greater food supplies and housing and things like that, and refrigeration. And you're able to basically make this curve go straight into the exponential growth phase. But then you're starting to get to a point here where, you start to decelerate, but then along comes modern science and medicine, and we are able to increase the number of individuals that can survive on the earth even more. And so, right now, estimates say there's about 7.5 billion people on the earth. So if we look at this chart here, we're about the year 2021, about right here where we are, about 7.5 billion. Now you can see we're closer to the end than we are to the beginning here. Some estimates say that the earth can hold about 9 to 12 billion people maximum, unless we come up with some new technology that can help us survive like before. And, some people say that we should reach about 9 billion in the next, 10 to 20 years. So we'll be able to see, just what the capabilities of the earth are, the carrying capacity of the earth. But I feel that the way technology is going, we might be more like this 12 billion number. So it'll be a while before we get there, probably year 2200 or so. So you have nothing to worry about. But yeah, this just gives you an idea of carrying capacity of the earth in regard to humans. We are limited by space, by food and water and things of that nature. So there is definitely a limit to the number of people that can live on the earth. All right. So let's talk about the homework today, what you're going to do for the homework. I'll be posting, there's a couple different simulations we're going to look at. One of them is with some dice, and one of them is a soap bubble. So let's talk about the dice simulation here. Here we started out with 50 dice. And so this population one we're looking at, we're talking about, we threw in a disease here called heart disease. So anytime I roll, let's say I rolled the dice, 50 dice, and every time there was a one came up, I removed those dice from the pool. So I started with 50, I rolled them, and I lost 8. So after the first generation, I lost 8. There's 42 left. So the percent surviving is 42 divided by 50, or 84%. Okay. So if you go to the next one, I rolled it again, and I came up with these numbers, 35, and the next generation, 29. So you will use the numbers that I've provided, or that have been provided in the homework, to calculate your percent surviving. So if you were on second generation, 35 out of 50 gives you 70%. So that's for heart disease only. So let's say I did the same simulation, but instead of just heart disease, I removed people or dice that came up with the number 1 for heart disease or number 2 for cancer. And you can see after the first round, I lost 17 dice, right? So my percent surviving, 33 out of 50, is 66. And the next round, I lost 11 more, so the percent surviving will be 44. So you can just tell by looking at the numbers here, you're going to have a sharper decline in population over here on the dual disease chart than you are on the single disease survival chart. And so you'll get these numbers, you'll fill them out, and then you'll be able to plot them on something that I provided called semi-log paper. So I don't want you to be scared of this. This is not that, it's not something we'll do a lot, and you won't be doing this on an exam, but I do want to make you familiar with what is semi-log paper. So on the x-axis, you can see these thicker lines are evenly spaced. And so I went ahead and gave them a number, an age number, okay, of 50. We'll say 5, 10, every one of these is 5, okay? But then you got on the y-axis, you got your percent surviving. So what is going on here? These numbers, They start out big and then they scrunch up and then they get big again, scrunch up. So if you look at 0.1 to 1.0, the distance from there is the same as the distance from 1 to 10 and the distance from 10 to 100. So basically, this is a way you can plot a large range of numbers on the same sheet of paper, basically. And what happens here we've kind of, it's not exactly half, but if you go from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, you can see it shrinks by about 2/3 as much. And there's a mathematical equation for this you don't need to know, but what you want to keep in mind is that 1 starts here and 10 is up here. And if I was to go from 10 to 11, then I would go to this next light line. So this goes from 10 to 20, but in here is 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, on up to 20. And the same thing. So when you go to plot your survivorship curves, you're going to start, and here I have age, it could be generations, whatever number, whatever you want to call this scale at the bottom. You can plot your numbers. So you're always going to start out with survivorship. You're going to start out at 0 times 0 and at 100%, because in the beginning, everything's surviving. And then you'll go from there. So if I do the first generation, I start out at 100%. And let's say I was doing this, let's do this cancer and heart disease one. I go from 100% to 66% after 1 generation. Okay, so let's just say this 5 is 1 generation. So I'll go from 100 down to 66%. So I would draw a line from 100 to this line at 66, okay? Now I've done and this kind of just explains the whole thing again, but I've done this probably not exactly what you'll see on the homework, but as far as your answers go, but I've done a chart here showing what my numbers I got. So you can see here, heart disease, it goes down at this rate. And then if you throw heart disease and cancer together, it kind of goes down at twice as fast. So I reach, the total, endpoint would be down here. I guess I didn't continue my line down to 0, but basically you can see that it decreases a lot faster than the heart disease alone. Now here you'll see the soap bubbles as well. This is part 2 of the lab that I didn't show you here. But in the homework in the lab is this part as well, soap bubbles. And if you graph all 3 of these, which I do not expect you to turn in the graph to me unless you feel like printing it out, drawing it out. You can do like this if you want, where I plotted single lines, but it's a pain in the butt. So just you can kind of use this as reference, but I wanted you to see, we talked about early on the different growth curve types. And soap bubbles, when you do the soap bubbles, the way we would do it if we were in the lab itself, is you would have one person blowing the bubbles and then 2 people trying to keep the bubbles aloft. So those 2 people will represent parental care. And so with parental care, you can keep that bubble alive, floating for a longer amount of time until it reaches, a certain time point. It's just going to pop. And so you see more popping later on in its life expectancy than you would at the beginning, because you get that nice parental care going on. So soap bubbles kind of represents the type 1 curve like humans, whereas heart disease is more like a type 2. Really, the cancer and heart disease, it kind of represents a type 3, not so much. Heart disease and cancer and heart disease are both type 2 curves, but they're, I guess the cancer and heart disease is closer to type 3. But anyway, the point is that you're basically likely to die at any point along the way, depending on what disease you have. All right, so that is the entire slideshow I have. Now let me show you the homework. Hopefully it will be easier to understand here. So same thing I just talked about, survivorship curves. Here's your 3 curves. And here's what I talked about, the dice game simulation. It goes into great detail how you would remove the ones for the population 1, and then population 2, you remove both the 1s and 2s, and how you calculate these percentages surviving. And then there's experiment 2 with the soap bubbles, where it shows how we set this up to keep the soap bubbles alive, floating in the air. And then you get these numbers. This is what I want you to do for the homework. I want you to fill in these numbers, calculating the percentage of survival. Remember, you start with 50. So after the first generation here, I lost 8. So 42 out of 50 gives you 84%. In the next generation, I lost like 7 more. So 35 out of 50 gives you 70%. So you'll just figure out these percentage numbers, right? Until you get down to 0. And then same thing for the sub bubbles, although it's been calculated here for you. These tick marks, these check marks are supposed to represent the number of bubbles dying at this time point, okay? So, you can do this. This column talks about total number dying at this age. Obviously, 2 check marks is 2. You get down here, 3 check marks for 14 is 3. And then you would calculate the number surviving at this age. So for the first first generation, we didn't lose any, but the second generation, at 2 seconds, we lost 1. So I take 50 minus 1 gives me 49. So at 3 seconds, I lost another one. So then you take that 49 and subtract 1, you're only down to 48. Does that make sense? So in the end, you should be down to 0, okay, after you go through and count all these up. And then from that number, that 49, you can figure percent surviving is 98%. Same as before, you got 49 out of 50, because we only did 50 of these sub-levels. So 49 out of 50 is 98%, 48 out of 50 is 96%. Those 2 things are really the only things you must do, and answer these questions for the homework. I have added that wonderful log scale paper here for you if you feel like printing it out and doing it. I'll see about getting you some bonus points, but I don't expect you to be able to do that. I just want you to get a feel for it and mess around with it if you want to see what it's like. But basically, fill out the 2 charts, this chart and this chart, and then answer these questions. And that's all the homework. Now, like I said, I'll have this homework and I'll have a quiz for you to do this week, but there are no labsters. And because of all the snow and everything that we've got this week, I want you to take the time to finish those 3 labsters from last week from the cell cycle. If you haven't done those, finish those and turn them into me, okay? And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. All right, you guys have a good week.